So we're going to get going, and for the live streaming and the archives, Dan Pacheco is going to be talking to us about virtual reality and augmented reality and journalism. And I really appreciate you making it all the way here from Syracuse. And he'll be doing a workshop tomorrow, 1:30. Do not forget. And take it away, Dan.
All right, thank you. So, Dan Pacheco, I work at the SI Newhouse School, Syracuse. Actually, it wasn't that big of a trip compared to other places. I was in Seoul twice this summer, and that was a big trip. Here's how to reach me. My info's out there, but
the Mexican province of
I want to show a little video here to get us started.
The Mexican province of Texas is not a part of the United States, although it has been populated by a steady stream of Americans. These Texians, as they are called, are Mexican citizens. Their province is part of the Mexican nation, but their difficulties with the central government have steadily increased. Now there is open rebellion.
March 5th, 1836. The siege of the Alamo.
Here we go.
You are there.
Anybody here watch this? I'm actually too young to have watched it. Walter Cronkite show back in I think the late 60s called You Were There. And I bring that up because, and I'm not the first person to make this analogy, but basically in journalism and storytelling and history, things like that, we've always been trying to trigger people's imaginations to make them feel like they're really present, right? And we now are at a point in time where we're able to actually put you there. And that's what I think is powerful about virtual reality, also augmented reality. And this is not a new thing, not a new concept. I think it's really central to storytelling. But also, VR is seen as a new thing. It's really not. It's been around for several decades now. And anybody remember this? Second Life. Okay, I'll use it. Did anybody actually develop in it? No? Nobody. I'm amazed. Well, I did. I was working for a newspaper in Bakersfield, California, and we created Virtual Bakersfield at a time when Reuters was creating its virtual islands so that you could connect with Reuters, and basically you'd have your avatar, and then you could buy an island with Linden dollars, which were basically like Korean won, where it's like 350,000 Linden dollars into the millions or whatever, and it'd be like $50. They had a virtual economy, and it was compelling enough. There were tools in there that made it easy for anyone to just kind of create some 3D information. And some media companies started to go in there and experiment. Also in the scientific community, you had NOAA and NIST, probably even NCSA, I'm guessing people here, who were just experimenting with the idea of using 3D tools to let you experience content, or do what Cronkite was doing too, where you are there. Ultimately, it became kind of a little bit of a joke, sadly, and keep this in mind if this happens again, because I think we're going to go through this wave again. The first time it was possible for you to create your own magical universe anywhere you wanted in the world, and then let people visit it. After a few years, guess what happened? Guess what people created? They created casinos because there was an economy, and they created basically virtual sex trafficking, and it got to be strange. And so then it kind of fell out of vogue, but it's still around. You can actually enter Second Life in a VR headset. If you look at what Facebook is doing and companies like that in VR, we're all going to be doing this with headsets on in some way. A movie that's coming out pretty soon called Ready Player One. Anybody read that book? So that's going to be turned into a movie soon. I'd recommend reading the book before the movie comes out, so it doesn't spoil anything. But rather, the movie doesn't spoil the book. But Spielberg is producing that, and it's about this immersive world where things are so bad on planet Earth that people just kind of check out, and they're living in this virtual world. And there's lots of analogies to Second Life there. So why is it that we want VR? And I like to think about this. it's kind of what Aaron Pilhofer was saying about, okay, well, why are you doing this? And I think number one, we human beings live in 3 dimensions. So we are 3-dimensional creatures, and yet all of our media is still 2-dimensional. All right, so as much as you may think, oh, VR is kind of this, this flashy thing, and it's so different from existing media, I'd turn that around and say, finally, our media can be in our full, can speak to our full 3-dimensional spatial experience. We learn through experience and not just in reading. If anyone's a teacher like me, you know that people do not learn by listening to people talk, which means you're not going to learn anything today from listening to me. You learn by doing things and with a full body experience. So this idea of learning in physical space, spatial narrative. If you went to Susan Polton's talk about what the Franklin Institute is doing, museums have been doing this all along, right? Where you're learning by interacting and touching things and working with them. Now, within journalism and media, we can do that, and I think it's really powerful. And there is a potential to build empathy, although I think it's very difficult and sometimes dangerous to try to force empathy. But there is an empathetic component here. And this is the most important thing to me, is understanding. Because I think that in this world, this environment where it's all about getting the most clicks and tweets and likes, and then getting conversions from Facebook and people coming to your website to get advertising revenue, we have to remember in journalism, well, why are we trying to do that? To sustain a business for shareholders? No, it's because we're trying to help people understand information that's important in society. And I feel like immersive media forms, whether it's VR, AR, MR, talk to me afterwards about what the difference is between those. That's why I think they're important. In context, I really see this as being primarily about the experience. What I find interesting about this is if you look at basically the big major sea changes in media over time, it was over 500 years before we moved beyond just one-way communication, all right? And basically everything from Gutenberg to television was about broadcasting in one way or another. And then in the 1980s with CD-ROMs, and then eventually with the internet, which moved into our pocket. Thank you, NCSA Mosaic, for getting us on that path. None of that's going away, but I feel like that chapter's sort of closing in terms of what we'll talk about being kind of at the edge. And I believe that experiential media forms are a big part of our future. It doesn't mean the other stuff disappears. You might even see, and you're actually already seeing, a lot of these existing forms moving into the experiential mode. But that's kind of how it fits in. So I believe we're in chapter 3. I could be wrong, and I'll be the first person to say that. But it's a pretty exciting space right now to be working in. So everyone and your dog is talking about VR. Is it real this time? We'll see. I highly recommend you look this up, the Oculus Rift. It was kind of funny. It was an April Fool's joke about, anyone have dogs? And you feel bad your dog's at home, so now your dog could, imagine that he was out in the grass. They didn't explain how, what the dog does in the grass fits in with being in your house. But so the person who really got me into this was Nani de la Peña. I'm not going to show this video, but if you go to emblematicgroup.com, or I have a YouTube link here, but I think we're providing slides to everybody at some point. Then you can look this up. This is called Hunger in Los Angeles, and it was back in 2012. Nani was working on her PhD at University of Southern California. She'd been a documentary filmmaker before this, and there was a project that the entire USC school there, at Annenberg School, was working on to help people connect with hunger. So this was, actually, she started working this back in, I think, around 2009 or 10, after the big recession, and people in LA who had been, happily employed before were suddenly standing in food lines. And so Nani went down to one of these food lines where it was, they were not able to keep up with demand. She and her assistant got some audio of what was happening there and also took a lot of photos. And she had been working in Second Life before, that's why I bring that up, and doing some really interesting other work, and felt like these VR headsets, before Oculus, there was one that the Media Mixer Lab there had. I think it was like a $60,000 headset, so VR is not a new thing. And she thought, well, this would be a really great way to connect people with this experience. And she really basically, she wanted people to understand that people standing in line waiting for food, that we're all very close to that experience at any time, especially when the economy goes south, right? So it's about removing that distance where you hear about something people are going through and you say, oh, those poor people over there. Those poor people up on that screen that I see, starving children in Africa or wherever it happens to be, or refugees in Syria, or in this case, your neighbors if you were standing in line for food. She wanted to let you jump in there, and then suddenly you have the experience of being there. So what she really modeled was this whole new idea of taking audio from real events, and then a whole lot of visual data and other cues, and recreating that using CGI. And then she married that to gaming software. So Unity is the software that she focused on, and motion technology from the motion picture industry, in particular, mocap, motion tracking. So the fact that you can, when someone is moving around, you have these cameras around them, they're wearing a suit with all these dots on them, then you can capture that motion and apply it to Spider-Man, or a troll, or Gollum, right? Stuff that was created for the movie industry. She then turned that inside out and used that to then track your position through a physical space so you could feel like you were there. Pretty cool idea, I think I'll say now. When she first debuted this, people at her university told her she was crazy, that this was unethical, that it would never work. She really was kind of a pariah within her own institution. She stuck with it. And thankfully, because of that, there are a lot of people, myself included, who are now, this has kind of taken over our lives. But she's a real pioneer there. I was so amazed at this feeling I had after going through hunger in Los Angeles, where I had memories for months afterwards, even dreams of having been standing in a food line, which I thought was powerful because I realized that this goes beyond just seeing a really good IMAX movie. I believed I was there. Part of my brain did. And a phrase you'll hear a lot out there is that VR tricks the brain into believing that you're present somewhere. And that's exactly what had happened. And I just thought, all right, this is, there's something important here. So fast forward a couple years later, I was contracted by USA Today to help them with some strategy. They wanted my help with something called Google Glass, if you remember that, to figure out what their strategy would be for Google Glass and smartwatches. I was going to spend the summer there. My university liked that. So I went there, but then in the time that we had planned things out to when I got there, I got the first Oculus Rift headset. And I'd been waiting for it. And I tried it out. I had been learning Unity thanks to what Nani showed me. And within minutes, I was able to just create an environment. I think it was the middle of winter in Syracuse, and I created a nice beach, because I'm part Puerto Rican. I was like, and I put that on, and it was just incredible. So I took that with me. I showed it to the people at Gannett at the very end of the day for a planning session, and to their credit, they said, let's forget about this Google Glass thing. We think this is actually going to be the future. Let's do something big in virtual reality. So Harvest of Change is what emerged from that. It was a story about, this is probably for people living in this area. It was in the Corn Belt in Iowa, so not too far away. And it was about trying to connect people with understanding where their food comes from, the people behind it. This was about a family that had had a farm in their family for 100 years, the Dahman family. And it was a large piece about changes in agriculture and also how food was suddenly turning into fuel and all these things. GPS-controlled tractors that were being deployed because there weren't enough young people to take over the farm. It was just really all about that. And it was Let's see here. Here we go. There were some traditional elements. So if you went to the Des Moines Register website, then you could watch all these videos, read all these different stories for like 7 days about this farm. And my team's part in this was to let you experience the farm in virtual reality. This worked in the Oculus. Keep in mind, nobody had an Oculus yet. So this was actually embedded on the website. But we went to different festivals and then would demonstrate this to people. One of those places was at the Online News Association conference in 2014. I remember a whole lot of people from different news organizations trying this out and having what I call the holy shit moment. Sorry, I was gonna say that. You take the headset off, and we've all had the holy shit moment in VR, right? It's like, holy shit, there's something powerful here. And I really believe it made a big difference. It was a proof of concept. We ended up getting an Edward R. Murrow Award, which I had nothing to do with because I didn't enter the contest, but it's nice to have that. There's all kinds of stuff that went on in there. If you come to a workshop tomorrow, I think it's at 1:30, I'm going to show examples of that entire farm scene. I actually have that on my laptop, and there are little hidden gems in there. One of the pieces that I always felt like, this is something we threw at the very end, was a three-dimensional data visualization showing how basically Iowa was feeding the world in a lot of ways, and also fueling the world. And so you could kind of look around this globe, and I've always felt like there's a lot of potential to that idea. And I feel that way in general about VR, that we're in such early days. You may be tempted to think, it's like, oh, okay, this is this, flash in the pan, it's this, the latest, shiny toy. And, it might be, I doubt it though. But we have not even begun to really explore what we're able to do, the impact we're able to have with virtual reality. And I think we'll see the same with augmented reality. So it's a good time to experiment. At around the same time, there were other media companies that started to experiment with VR over the next couple years. One of them was the Wall Street Journal. This is from a guy named Roger Kenney. He created a three-dimensional tour of the stock market, so you could really connect with the highs and lows and basically go through the history of remember the boom days and the bust. And so as you're kind of moving along here, then you see, this is really a spatial narrative around the stock market. And, of course, then we all remember, it's like, okay, this makes so much sense to me. You get to the top, and you're like, we're gonna go on a long, wild ride. We all went through that, right? So you can do it here in VR, and this was made for cardboard. So there's a bubble busting. All right. Early experiments. Some people, I remember, looked at that and said, oh, this is so gimmicky, seriously. But I think that it really was, it was just the beginning. So the next, I think it was about 18 months later, then Roger created this along with Emblematic Group, which is Nani's company, where you could, you've probably seen this chart before on the Wall Street Journal website. It's a map of the market, and it's been a three-dimensional, hour by hour view of the highs and lows of the market to help stock traders understand, how they should invest. In this case, they had an app you could use. I believe it was with HoloLens, but it might have been with Project Tango, and just understand the data, right, by experiencing it. And it's again that concept of having a what I call a full body experience with information. There was that. I love this one too from the Los Angeles Times, where they took LiDAR data from NASA of Mars, and then in a Google Cardboard headset, you could then move through Mars and get build some spatial understanding about how large, in this case, Mount Olympus is. There's some audio that you would hear kind of behind this. Cool thing about this is it ran just in a web browser using something called WebVR. So every web browser, including on your phone, can be a virtual reality device, which is pretty much how Google Cardboard works. But again, it's an early experiment, and I like to include these because I feel like one day we're going to look back at these when the history of VR is written, and things are going to be so much more amazing. And this is going to be, like the first silent films, or the first of any type of media, or the first Bible printed by Gutenberg. And just because they're not perfect doesn't mean that they're not important. This was a project from one of my students, along with Ben Kramer, who, I don't know if Matt Waits here, but he's just
The ancient city of Antiochia ad Cragum, located on Turkey's southern coast, dates back to about 170 BC and was an outpost for pirates.
So
The city was incorporated into the Roman Empire in the 1st century AD.
it's kind of hard to see here, but you hear this audio from Ben talking about this place, and it looks real, right? That's actually all in virtual reality in an HTC Vive. And as what he did is he flew drones over these archaeological sites in Turkey, and then had the drone take a whole lot of photos that overlap with each other about 30%. If you do that with any camera of anything, we could do it right here, you can then use a process called photogrammetry to turn it into a 3D model. So Ben had all these 3D models, had them up on his website. One of the students in my virtual reality class was interested in this, and I said, oh, I know Ben, connected them. Ben was working for the BuzzFeed News Labs, and then together, basically Evan Jenkins then created the walkthrough of this site. So if you think about that, it's kind of amazing. There's a place, on the other side of the world, for most people, unless you're in Turkey, and has limited access, and now you can be there, right? This is the same thing Walter Cronkite was talking about, and you feel like you're there. You can tell it's CGI, but it's also, it's a little bit more real. And the term for this kind of experience is reality capture. So we're having to come up with all kinds of a whole new vocabulary for the different storytelling components in this new medium. But that was produced by a student who had no prior VR experience. He took a 3-credit class that I teach to journalists, filmmakers, basically all the different communications fields that Newhouse teaches in. And with a few skills, he was able to then create a walkthrough of that, right? So I point that out because I'm going to show you some other examples of what students have done, and you've seen what has been done in other news organizations. Aaron Pilhofer was talking about 6x9. It was only $10,000, right? This stuff it doesn't have to be expensive. It doesn't have to be difficult, but you can, if you spend time, you can do a lot. Here's another piece that this is from Nani's company again. It's called After Solitary. She got a grant along with Frontline PBS to really push the envelope in VR. And while you see the mouse there, this is on my computer. What I want to point out is you see this bedroom, you see this man standing here. The native format for this content is in virtual reality. And basically you have a fully photogrammetrically captured or recreated bedroom that you can walk through. You can look under the bed even. And then also you can see this cell that this man was in for several years. He went crazy. It's actually the same subject as from the 6x9 piece. For some reason, they both focus on the same story. And Nani really wanted you to have the sense of being in this cell. This is the real walls and everything of the cell, by the way, along with this former prisoner who's very large, as you can see, to understand why he basically went insane, started pulling all the hair out of his body at the point where he had to, he was clawing his flesh off, writing in blood on the wall, asking for help, and it drove him nuts. And so it's another piece of, this is a piece of empathetic media. But what she would tell you is that, why are you in there with him? So you can understand and feel the inhumanity of it. So that's the empathy piece, right? And there are some things that just like, think about whether it's positive or negative experiences you've had in life. You're trying to explain them to somebody and you get caught up for words. What is it that you ultimately say? I guess you had to be there, right? Now it's possible to go beyond that and say, here, would you like to be there? That's what I think is powerful about these. So there's been a lot of ongoing development by news organizations in this space since then. 360 video is probably the most common form right now because it's very easy to create 360 video. For those who may think, oh, 360 video is not VR, I don't actually care. You have VR headsets. 360 video is one way to capture reality. 360 3D video is another. Computer-generated imagery is another. And as you can see with photogrammetry and also videogrammetry, those worlds are moving together very quickly. The man in the cell that you saw there, if you experience that in the HTC Vive, you can walk all the way around him. He's a full hologram. And he was not computer-generated. He was captured by about 40 cameras at a company called 8i in Los Angeles, and then they create basically kind of like stop-motion 3D models. So all of these are kind of different aspects of the same thing. But for 360 video, it's very easy to get into this. I actually brought a 360 camera here, and I know I've seen a couple of you also have some. Who has the Insta360? I saw, yeah, you have one? Okay, so a few of you have that. It's an attachment on an iPhone. 360 video is really starting to take off. It's very easy to produce. It's hard to, just as with any kind of media, it's hard to produce well. So I'll give a few tips about that tomorrow. USA Today went on to create its own kind of virtual reality channel. It's on YouTube as well as their own website. It's called Virtually There. At that time, every week they'd have a new story. So you can see, okay, VR witnesses returning to Normandy, divers descending into an abandoned nuclear silo. These are all things that, this is the kind of thing that, you might do, a kind of a deep dive video for this. But with 360, then you can feel like you've jumped inside the experience. I call that transferred reality. That's my term, but we're going to laugh at all these terms one day. The New York Times launched something called the Daily 360 that many of you have probably used. All right, did anybody get New York Times subscribers? Did you get the cardboard in the mail from New York Times, right? So that was kind of a big watershed moment. I think they sent 1 million of them out. So there's a lot of experimentation going on right now. And also globally. So this is something that people in the US don't know about, but Euro News Service, it's run by, they have a 360 channel. It's run by a guy named Thomas Semat. Really, great guy, very innovative. And it's pretty cool. I mean, if you're if you look at a lot of the stories there, this is a way to kind of bridge divides between countries, right? Where, especially when with the Syrian refugee crisis, one of the best videos I ever saw was of in Calais, where all these Syrian refugees were trying to basically break into trucks, or lorries as they call them, and literally jumping on top of they'd stop trucks on the highway, and then another group would then jump on top, burrow into the truck, cut it open, get inside, with the hopes that they could then make their way into England, right, because of what they were dealing with. And, in my memory, part of my brain knows that I was not there, but another part forgets that I wasn't there, right? So that's how powerful this is. If you're interested in learning more about this, I have a class that I teach, as I mentioned, to students who are from all communications fields, as well as students from our architecture school, from School of Visual and Performing Arts, which is basically people who want to work for Pixar, go there. And they take this class, and they often have no experience with anything in 3D, never experience with coding, and they get very far. So I'm going to show you a few examples of what they've been able to do, or actually beyond the one that Evan Jenkins did. So this is from a student named Aubrey Moore, and she went to the Women's History Museum right around the time of the elections. There were a lot of protests going on there with the Women's March and everything. And she got 360 video of it. But then when she went to the Women's History Museum, which is where it's based around Susan B. Anthony, she just really wanted people to connect with that place and those objects and have the experience of being able to go there. And so her initial idea was, because she had been a photographer and she was a photo student, she said, okay, I can create 3D models by just taking still photos. I want to 3D image the entire thing. I said, okay, Aubrey, you have 3 weeks. Maybe focus on a few objects. So she said, okay. So she went and did that, and she went further than I've seen any of my students go. So you'll see some examples here, but basically this is a combination of CGI and captured reality photogrammetry. This room is CGI, the barrel CGI. This desk here is a 3D model that she created with photogrammetry. And then she interviewed the docent from the museum, and as you approach different the 3D models, then you're hearing the docent talk about that part of history. So, I mean, this is a real piece of experiential storytelling. Oh, here we go. I forgot I had a video. So you can move through it, right? A lot of the objects look kind of melty, but that's okay because this is what's possible today. So I like to really push students to do what we call field tests. Try to go so far that they're gonna fail at their ultimate vision, but they're gonna learn along the way and then figure out what's possible today and then project ahead to where things might be. Has anyone been to that museum? You can tell me if I haven't myself, but I feel like I have. That's another student, Jackie Prager. She was a film student. So Aubrey was a photo student. This is a film student. And actually, I'm sorry. Jackie was a broadcast journalism major. And she was really interested in this whole Dakota Access Pipeline story and the protests happening there. So she went, I just laughed because I know how much work they put into this. She had this idea, and I said, okay, well, here's what you're going to have to do. And she wasn't afraid, right? It wasn't like people working in a newsroom were like, oh, we don't have the resources for that. She just went and did it. And it didn't cost her any money. She basically created 3D models of, there were like 6 or 7 different Native Americans she created using something called Fuse, a free piece of software from Adobe. Used a website called Mixamo that Adobe had purchased to then animate the 3D models. Got some audio from the protest, put that in there, recorded some audio, and then gave you the experience of moving through this space.
The Sioux tribe dates back
this
to
is
the 1800s.
the recording
Today,
is
our
kind of
reservation could be
glitchy.
found on lands
It was
that
actually very
built an oil
smooth in person,
pipeline
but
from North Dakota to Iowa,
she
called the
built
Dakota
the
Access
pipeline.
This pipeline would span
It turned out that it was actually a lot
1,000
larger than
miles
this, so
and
she had
cost
to
about
then,
$4 billion
this was like version
to
1.0.
construct.
But
Thousands
then you
of people
ultimately then
have
end up
come down to stand
there
in
at the
front of
protest, and you
reservation
could do all this
protest
within an
the construction
Oculus.
of the pipeline. Protests are starting to
Just went incredibly far. I was very
Mercenaries
proud of her.
fire, tear
But
gas.
the reason I like to show these is just to give you a sense of how far you can go, right? And encourage everyone to just experiment. Right now, all the tools are mostly free because these companies are trying to build the market, right? And so this is the best time to learn and the least expensive time to learn. Last example I'll show is from Carly Port. She was the film student. She's Jewish American. And when she was in a study abroad, she went to visit one of the Auschwitz camps, which obviously, if you're Jewish, that's even more, powerful for you. And she was very disturbed. I guess there are 2 camps in one of them. She thought they didn't really do a very good job with it. It seemed kind of theme parky. And so she took her photos of that place and then found some 3D models that were similar to the objects in the photos. It was very upfront about how this is interpolated. Based, she went as far as she could, and then married the experience of moving through Auschwitz with historical audio interviews from a survivor. And the result was kind of chilling.
If this area, if this tree, if this ground,
so that's the survivor
if that ground over there could only talk.
Talking about kids who were
what took place on this,
separated from
this
their parents.
area is just
And you can move through the scene, and as you approach different objects, then it triggers different audio.
undescribable.
And kind of jumped ahead here.
They were working every single day, and they knew what was going on inside. And sometimes they even worked on bodies of their own relatives.
And then you
And
get
they
to the
said
gas
the
chambers and
hardest, the
everything.
most
So, what do I like about that? You're there in Auschwitz, right? And it does seem kind of, I think that Unity's kind of imperfect gamey kind of approach actually achieved what she wanted. She wanted to give you the experience of being in this place that seemed like it was a park and it was all really nice. But then she brought in the humanity of what happened there and actually created in her mind a more accurate experience about what that place really was about. We've also had some students create startups out of the innovation lab. So this was an engineering student named Pratesh. He's actually now working out of Austin, and he got some funding. And he wasn't really a news or journalism person, he didn't even take a class. He just hung out in my lab, and I let him sit in on the class because I figured that maybe by osmosis, some of his coding experience would then flow into my students, and some of them did work on projects together. We started something called Little Maxima. It really is the first news reader for virtual reality, and now he's built 360 video into it. I don't think my video is working. Here, let me see if it's, yeah, I'm not sure if this is sorry. Oh, here we go. This is sort of a little promotional, but so you have a globe, and then you see stories around the globe. He's from India, so he's very much into global awareness. And then you could then focus in, fly towards an article. So you're doing this with the Oculus hand controllers. And then you go down to that place you could read. That was version 1.0. I told them, reading in VR, not so great. But the new version, if you download it, has 360 videos. So it's a way for you to, the way it feels is you have this globe, and just like with Google Earth, you can fly down to different locations where something's happening, and then you have the 360 video in that place that you watch, and then you zoom back out, right? So it's another example of how you are there. And while it is just an interface to that information, it's really very natural. You can spend a lot of time in there if you want to then connect with these news stories. Ethics are really important. There's totally new questions that we all, not just journalists, need to ask about these media forums. I have a few examples here, and we get to Q&A if you have others. I'd love to hear them because I think that this is an important time to talk about these things. In 360 video, first of all, just in terms of problems, there's no behind the camera. So this idea of framing a shot, forget it. You can't, okay? Which means that if you don't realize that every time you're capturing something, and you're just focusing on something happening here, what's happening back here or behind me? The editing becomes a lot more important, and making sure that you look at every single part of your scene to make sure you didn't get something that you didn't intend to, or which may even have some legal issues behind it. And one example I know of that the BBC ran into is when they went to that refugee camp in Calais, they weren't able to use a lot of the footage because the BBC has a policy about not showing dead bodies, and there apparently were a lot of dead bodies in the camp. And so they found themselves just having to they couldn't take you all the way in there. Also, speaking of that, is it okay to digitally remove things from a video? Okay, and you may, who thinks, okay, in 360, is it permissible to digitally remove something to basically change it? Who thinks that's never permissible? So pro and con. Okay. No, you still thinking about it? Let's say it's a fire hydrant, and I don't want the fire hydrant in my shot. Is it okay for me to erase that? Yes? Any yeses? Any no's? No's? Lots of no's? Okay. What about your tripod? You have a tripod below. Remember, it's 360. It's okay to remove the tripod? Yeah? Okay. Because this is actually common practice now, but when 360 first came into the scene, no one knew the answer to that, and there was a lot of debate about these kinds of things. And just so you know, you can very easily remove the tripod by taking a picture down below, and then you just put that in as what's called a nadir spot. And so you're still representing reality, but there's some time shifting going on there. So these are things that I think a lot of, well, this is a big one. And if you ever shoot 360 video, you're going to, what I like to tell people is you're going to get to know your nose hair really well. Because you start the camera and you're like, oh, and you always see a shot of you there, right? Then you have to decide, am I going to stay here? Am I going to hide, right? Which looks really odd and suspicious when you're putting some technology that's beeping and flashing lights in a public place, just so you know, or do you just stay in the scene? These are things that you get to decide that, but we're still figuring out what all the rules are around this. Staging, this is an issue that has come up. Is it okay to prompt an interview subject with questions that they answer while they're facing the camera? All right. So let's say that I'm interviewing you right here. I put a camera here, and I want it to feel like I'm sitting talking to you. Right? We're at a coffee shop, okay? But I don't want to be in the shot. So I put a camera over the table, and then I do a practice interview, right? And you practice your responses, and then I leave, and we record, and then you give the responses. Then I digitally edit in my questions, so it feels like I, as the interviewer, as a viewer, am also the interviewer. How do y'all feel about that? Okay? Not okay? Who thinks that's definitely okay? Why? You just do. It just feels wrong to you. Because it's different, right? Is anyone here, has anyone worked in radio, public radio? Or been interviewed by and had a radio interview? Okay. So you probably know this. When you have an NPR interview, they do exactly this in audio, okay? But from a newspaper perspective, it seems weird, right? All the rules change because the medium requires it to. But we should talk about, what's okay and what's not okay and why, and then be very transparent, I think, about those reasons. Is it okay to ask subjects to return to the scene of some event and reenact what happened to them and to present that reenactment as part of the journalism? Okay? Who thinks that's okay? Who thinks that's definitely not okay? Nobody wants to answer it, see? It's like, not sure, okay? So the very first big 360 video the New York Times did was called The Displaced, and they did this. And Bob Kaiser of the Washington Post called them out publicly and was like, you should never be allowed to do that. Then this big sort of a Twitter war erupted. And those things are still being discussed. We're so early into this. But anyone in documentary film would know this is what you do all the time in documentary film. So, computer-generated simulations. This is where it gets really a lot more difficult. So, how far do you need to go in order to accurately predict every detail? This is pretty much what Nani and Emblematic Group run into all the time because most of what they do is done in CGI. All right, so you look at Hunger in Los Angeles. All the buildings that you see there, they're not the real buildings. They're interpolations, kind of like what you saw at the Auschwitz camp, because the technology did not exist, and Nani didn't have the budget, because she was spending her own money, to build all that stuff. She was very transparent about the fact that this is not the real buildings, that she just went into the Unity Asset Store and just downloaded a bunch of stuff. But these are decisions you're going to end up making if you move into VR. So is it okay to use pre-existing assets that are close enough? Yeah, probably depends on how good they are. And I'll give you one example of a project they did. They created the experience of being there when Trayvon Martin was shot, or right before it. And so she had the real audio from the Zimmerman call, right? So the 911 tapes you probably all heard. And then 911 tapes from people who called in after they heard the shot. She lucked out and found the exact model of the car that Zimmerman was driving up in a site called TurboSquid. So she used that. They then got the schematics of all the apartment buildings and then paid someone to 3D model that, including the interiors. And then, this is something you can try in Cardboard, by the way, if you want to check it out. It's Trayvon Martin VR. And then you don't see him get shot because nobody was there to see that other than Zimmerman. But then you hear the gunshots when people were calling in from their apartments in 911, right? So Nani went to great lengths to make sure that she was very clear about what they knew that they could then base CGI journalism decisions on, and what they didn't know, right? And she drew the line at saying, I can't put you there at the scene because we don't know what happened, exactly. All we know is, what people heard, what came through, and what Zimmerman said. And then this one here, where do you draw the line between reality capture and 3D modeling? So this is starting to come up with photogrammetry. There's a piece, I don't think it's fully launched yet, but if you go to the right conference, you could try it out. It's the latest piece between Frontline PBS and Emblematic, and it's about climate change. You go to the Arctic, and you kind of experience the glaciers, crashing into the sea. You then see examples of what it was like, even 30 years ago, and you kind of see the glaciers move towards you. It's a really cool piece of science journalism. But there are some scenes there where you're walking kind of over the Arctic tundra. Well, guess what? The Arctic tundra was computer generated, and then part of it was created with drones flying over. Okay, there's so much work that went into that. I don't know if we'll ever see that again. But they had to really decide, where do we focus our energies? One of the Arctic research vessels, they had someone take thousands of photos from the inside of it, and then had drones fly over from the outside to then create an extremely accurate photogrammetrically created model of the ship. And you're on the Arctic ship, and then you see one of the scientists kind of materialize in, which is kind of odd. If you ever try it, it's like people beaming in like Star Trek. And then he's talking to you, and it's this combination of all these different methods. It's a really amazing piece. But you have to decide up front, how far do you go and when? And what Emblematic is doing is actually, partially they're trying to spark those questions. The Knight Foundation wanted them to do that. This is something I've been thinking about a lot. It's, how much is too much? So this is a piece called 846. I don't even know if you can download it anymore because it was so controversial. And you're in the Twin Towers when they get hit. It was sometimes referred to as the 9/11 game. You put the Oculus on, and then you have to figure out then, after you see the plane hit the other building and everything shakes, then you try to get out of the building. And, as was accurate for a lot of people who lost their lives there, in this case you can't. And you have two choices to make. One, you can asphyxiate. Two, you can pick up a computer monitor, what was your office, throw it at the window, and jump out. Those are the only two ways to win the game, right? Who thinks that's appropriate? Anybody? Okay. Who thinks it went too far? So, I don't think there's a right answer to that, and I compare it to Saving Private Ryan. Who thinks that it was okay to create, the opening part of Saving Private Ryan in particular, soldiers who went through that, a lot of them said, why would you ever make a Steven Spielberg feature-length movie about this, right? And others said, wow, I really want to connect with that historic event, okay? I think 846 fits right in there because the people who were most interested in that were, and this is how I learned about it, one of my students was 5 years old when 9/11 happened, and he had vague memories of seeing things on TV and that something bad had happened. And he remembered the plane hitting the building. And then it changed his entire life. You think about that, right? He's the 9/11 generation. And he just wanted to connect with it. So to him, it wasn't a game. This is something that I'm actually going to be exhibiting next week in Syracuse. There's an actual survivor of Hiroshima bombing who's visiting. And there's a high school teacher who worked with some students over 8 years to recreate Hiroshima as it was in CGI using architecture software. So you can go through the Hiroshima of antiquity, which is really cool. But then guess what happens? As you're moving through it in this beautiful place, then you hear a plane coming, you hear warning, the warning signals telling you to seek cover. And then you see the plane over you, the bomb drops, then you're in literal hell. There's fire everywhere, the buildings are then destroyed. You're actually seeing something that nobody who was there at that spot would have seen because they would have been incinerated. And it's extremely traumatic, okay? I don't know how people are gonna react to that. We're gonna have a counselor nearby just in case. I can tell you that the Japanese-American professor who actually is bringing this to Syracuse, when she tried it, she said afterwards she broke down, had to go back to her office and almost had to cancel a class because for her, that was like Carly's Auschwitz piece for her people. So we never know how people will react, and it's going to depend a lot on, you know, their backgrounds, their, you know, just their life experiences. So I think we need to really think about how do we prepare people for what they're about to experience, because it's different from watching a movie. All right, I've got 10 more minutes, and then I think we'll be done. But I just want to, I'll get into a lot more of this. Actually, I'll save 5 minutes for questions. I'll get into a lot more of this tomorrow, but you know, how do you get started if you want to you know, learn about 360 video and Unity? It's not difficult. So when it comes to cameras, it used to be you had to stitch images from a bunch of GoPros. Now you can just get these stitchless solutions. You're just talking about a few $100s, like the ones you all have. And then there's something called Unity that is used to create the CGI images. And A-Frame is a open source WebVR library, so you can learn about that at the workshop tomorrow as well. And none of this costs any, I mean, the cameras cost money, but the software, you probably already have it or it's free. It used to be that for professional stuff, you had to stitch all these images together, and it was a huge pain. And then eventually then some stitchless solutions came out. The Nokia Ozo was, up until recently, the best solution for stitchless camera, but it started out at $60,000, then it got dropped to $45,000, and now, as of this week, there's a pro version of Insta360 that's $3,500. Things have changed so fast, and that's an 8K camera, all right? So stitching used to be what you'd have to do. You'd have a bunch of GoPros you'd stick together, all right? And then you'd get this one image. Do not learn stitching. So one thing I want you to take away is, like, I just want to make sure nobody spends any time learning how to stitch video for 360, because it's not necessary anymore. That used to be like a quarter of our class. And then if you have Adobe Premiere, there's a plugin which used to cost $180. It's now free because Adobe bought it, called Skybox VR Tools. And it basically lets you create this two-dimensional text effect. So if you've seen 360 videos where you put the headset on and it looks like the text is floating in front of you, sorta, it's done with Skybox, and it just distorts the text so that when the entire image is moved into 360, then it looks like it's floating and it's straight. Then Unity, I like to quote Shakespeare here: "All the world's a stage, and this is yours." This is actually the scene for Harvest of Change that Ray Soto built, and I have it on my laptop. And if anyone's interested in the project, we can open it up, and I can show you exactly how it's built. There's nothing special about what you're seeing here other than the assets. The assets were really top quality because Ray spent his career as a game developer. He actually worked on one of the Ultima games and some other Call of Duty type of games. And he's, I think, probably one of the world's first CGI journalists who came from the gaming industry. He decided to become a journalist, which I think is kind of cool. So he works at USA Today. So that's a real place that he recreated. And then Playmaker, which I'll talk about a little bit tomorrow too. If you want to create things that are interactive, there's a plugin called Playmaker for Unity. And what you see here is I have some avatars that have animations connected with them. And down here at Playmaker, it's what's called a fixed state machine. And you can just, I like to think of it as smart Legos. You just have different states that you set up, and then you add actions. So play animation, move from one place to another, stop. There's no coding involved, which I think is why a lot of game developers even use it. And these tools are really inexpensive. You might even be able to find a free version somewhere. So there I have my avatar moving. So this stuff it's not difficult. And if you want to get into AR, I'm actually right at the beginning of this. But there's a plugin called Vuforia for Unity that lets you develop for free, and then if you want to deploy it, it's $500. This here is some video from one of the students in my online master's class who, all on his own, in a matter of weeks, used Vuforia to create an AR experience on the phone. In this case, he's a broadcast journalism professor. Sorry, it's so quick. But his goal there was that if you're where he was testing is if you're watching a broadcast news segment, maybe you could hold your phone up and get more information overlaid on top of what you're seeing on the broadcast news piece about the stories. In this case, it's a 3D map, right? So the fact that he was able to do that, you know, with no money and no instruction from me, I think says a lot. So I'm now going to be incorporating Vuforia into what we teach. And then just the last thing I'll kind of leave you with is, you know, what happens eventually when what Mark Zuckerberg has been promising, VR and AR headsets just become glasses. I mean, this is a real project that Facebook's working on. Apple is allegedly working on something along these lines. They've filed patents. The patent you see here is from Magic Leap, which is a company that still has yet to show anything to anybody, but they got billions of dollars, which is crazy. But this is sort of like the Holy Grail, right? And imagine that instead of checking out of your world, you just have your glasses on, and then this is your living room. You don't have a big screen TV. You don't have, maybe you don't even have anything other than a place to sit and kind of props. But what you see is all virtually overlaid. Sounds kind of crazy. If you've ever tried Microsoft HoloLens, it is possible to do things like this right now. It's just the field of view is really low. So this is kind of what I get paid to do, is think ahead to, all right, what happens if and when we're at that point? Because we know the technology's there and it just takes time for it to really get to the right form factor. How does that change everything, right? And so, could mobile phones disappear? We were at the MobileMe&You conference. This is definitely what Zuckerberg, who runs Facebook, which owns Oculus, so I like to call them on your Facebook, this is his vision of where things will go. And imagine that everything around us is part of the canvas of media. So despite all that, it's really not about just geeking out, although I am a geek, but think about the story, anything that you try to explain to somebody and you get lost for words and say, I guess you had to be there. Now we can take you there. That's the magic of it. And think about what stories lend themselves most to immersion, I think is just in general important. Don't just do something in VR or AR or MR because you think it's neat. Maybe that's the way to start. But ultimately, in not too long, I think with 360 video, we're already at this point where we have to ask, okay, why is this story perfect for 360 and immersion, right? If it's not, then don't do it. But if it is, then you should focus on that. So that's all I have. Anyone has questions or thoughts or feedback? We'd love to hear it. Aaron.
Can you talk a little bit about sourcing? It's something that's Susan raised, and it's something that we've struggled with for 6x9. But when you're creating these environments, it's difficult to indicate to somebody whether this was just an asset that happened to look cool, so we're just going to drop it here, versus something that you've actually reported. How do you think about this in the journalistic context?
Yeah, I think it's really hard. For one thing, a lot of these experiences people don't really enter with any context. And it's hard right now to put the context into the experience or it feels weird, right? So I think there are ways, maybe if you're talking about something that's computer generated, when you approach an object, you could have something like an audio credit or even text that sort of floats over somewhere, or maybe a little information box, which if it's something that they can interact with, then they could touch that, because you don't say click anymore, and then they get info. But I've been thinking about this a lot too, just in the context of this Hiroshima piece that I'll be exhibiting. I'd say if I had created that, I don't think I'd want to exhibit it because of that, right? I have questions myself when I go through there about, okay, like what are they basing these, this recreation on? Are there photos that exist that they built the models from? And I do know for sure that if you go that far with recreation, you better have something on a website somewhere that answers all those questions. And at minimum, I think we have to do that. But it's a lot of extra work too. So, the further down this rabbit hole you go, the more work you create for yourself. It's kind of always that way.
Has this ever been tested in? Oh, I'm sorry. Has this ever been tested in court? I mean, has anybody ever taken a VR in and had a judgment on whether it was allowable or not?
Not that I've never heard of that happening. But since you brought up court, I do know that there have been court cases where they've done VR recreations of of the scene, and then the jury then
Yeah,
goes
that's
through
what I
and
was
tries it
wondering.
out.
I mean, yeah, I was
But,
wondering.
I don't know if you're talking about that or you're talking about legal challenges.
That's really what I was
Yes,
what I
no,
was
that's-
referring to.
I think it's not a cottage industry yet, but there are companies that specialize in that, and they're selling. So, yeah.
But
I think
again,
that's where you get into almost like propaganda, though, right? Because you have then your point of view, right? In that case, you're trying to prove or disprove, and that's a different thing.
and it comes down to, well, what's the real asset and what's CGI too? Like, when you're creating that, I mean, that's all part of, you could argue either way with that. So
Sure.
it's interesting.
That's true in video today already, though. We all should already be asking, is this real or not? So we talk about fake news a lot, fake video, and then fake 3D stuff. Like, it's going to be a thing. Get ready. So. All right. Are we done? All right.
Yeah,
Well, I know I'm
thanks
between
so
you
much.
and drinks, so.
Yeah. So before you launch, I'm hoping everybody will check out the demonstrations. People have spent some time on them. There are 4 demonstrations downstairs, and I think it's 1005, 1005, and then there are 2 demonstrations on the second floor. We're handing these out so you can see what they're about. If you registered, on the back of your ticket is 2 tickets for beverages, and we'll start tomorrow morning, I think about 8:30, and have sessions. Don't forget about the workshops tomorrow afternoon, but we'll remind you of those too. So, but please see the demonstrations. Folks have spent some time preparing them, and take a tour, get a drink, and take a tour of everything going on at school here. And thank you, Dan. Thanks.
All right,
Thanks, everybody.